Okay, so if you're going to remove your drive shaft in order to work on your U-joints, in my case, it's a little bit convoluted because I don't quite have the right setup. So what you see in the picture there is the differential and the floor jack. And what we need to do is lift up the rear wheels so I can rotate the yoke where the drive shaft connects to the differential. I'll show you that in a minute. And we have to spin it around so I can get at it with my breaker bar. There are 4 12mm 12-point bolts that have to come out to free up the yoke where it meets. Gotta get the tires off the ground. There we go, that should do it. And that's where the yoke meets the differential. There's also a few bolts we gotta pull for the carrier bearing. So I just put the vehicle in neutral. And then we're gonna see if I can show you this here. Wow, that's super sketchy. All right. So you see how that's turning? We may not be able to, let's see. Yeah, okay, you can see it. So I've already taken 3 of the bolts out. We're gonna spin this around. Line up bolt number 4. It's right where I need it. More or less. There we go. So then we have to put transmission back in gear so that we have resistance so we can work on pulling this bolt. And very important, you got to get it back on the ground. Also very important, that was a very sketchy lift I did. And you should never, ever go under a vehicle with a lift that sketchy without having some floor jacks to back you up. So, closer look. That's the bolt in question. There are 4 of them. I've taken 3 out. That's number 4. I have to line these up, break them loose with breaker bar before I get them out. Let me do that, and I'll bring you back for the disassembly of the carrier bolt mount. Okay, so before I try to knock the yoke loose from the differential, I wanted to show you, long ago I painted that corner, and the reason why is you need to line up the yoke back onto your differential the way that you found it. And the reason why you do that is to maintain the balancing of the drive shaft. Now this differential is new to this truck. It's not the original. It's got a new rear axle in it, so I don't know how relevant that is in my case, but I do have a paint mark. And I suggest if you're keeping your original axle, you do a paint mark so you can line everything back up. All right, moving on. So over here, a little further up the drive shaft, this is a 2-part drive shaft, so it has a carrier bearing in the middle right here, and it needs to come out. The way you get that out would be, I can get the camera to cooperate here. Here we go. There's a 15mm bolt there and a 15 right there. Pull those puppies out. The whole carrier bearing assembly comes out, and then you should be able to knock this off of the differential. At this point it's just being held by friction. You knock that down, and then the yoke up there is just being held in by basically friction. So you can just pull it all out, and then we'll move the drive shaft to the bench, because the whole point of this exercise is I'm replacing the 3 U-joints that are located in the drive shaft. There's one up there, you can see it. There is one right here at the carrier bearing. And there is one back here at the rear yoke where it connects to the differential. Let me get this carrier bearing out, bring you back. Okay, here we go, drive shaft. So that's what it looks like. Like I said, you disconnect it here in the back, you knock that loose, make sure that the vehicle is settled. Mine, this didn't want to come out, and the reason why is the vehicle wanted to move forward. As soon as I knocked it loose, it lurched forward a few inches, so be aware of that. That is the carrier bearing right there. It's looking kind of crusty. I may replace it. I haven't decided yet. And then come on over here. That's your input shaft. Plugs into the back of the transmission where the output shaft is. It just kind of sits there. It actually winds up splining in is what happens. But anyway, what I am interested in are these 3 U-joints. They have some little tiny bolts. Hold them on. And these are pretty sloppy. See how easily that moves? It's not supposed to do that. It's supposed to be a bit stiffer. And they are held in place by these fancy little snap rings. And you've got one per end. So I'm going to need to take some pliers. I do have a whole set of snap ring pliers. I don't know if they apply these in particular. If you don't have snap ring pliers, not a big deal. You can take some regular pliers, pry these out. Might want to use penetrating oil. They might be kind of rust welded on, wherever, depending on the climate you live in. Let me show you the caps. Here we go. The carrier bearing U-joint has these little caps here. Alright, I'm going to start working on that. I'll bring you back at the highlights. I didn't do it earlier. Go ahead and do it now. These are Spicer 5-153X U-joints. They are the 1310 series U-joints, which are compatible with this driveline. And if you use the 1310s, you can use the same U-joint for all 3 locations. Hey guys, it is the next day and some work has already happened. Take a look. The U-joint is out, the old one anyway. This is the other end. This is the bracket that mounts to the differential. Goes on that end. Yep, goes here, like so.
So there's some burrs on this I gotta knock out.
So here is one of the old U-joints. It wasn't in terrible shape, but it wasn't in great shape either. So what my brother's working on right now is he's making sure that the mating surface for the cap of the bearing, which this is the cap right here, is relatively smooth.
The old one was rust welded, or it caught some dirt when it was getting punched through and it burred up the inside edges. And you can install a nice clean bearing into a burred up edge, it's going to catch and get scored and bad things.
What he said. So this is the differential end, and then over here, this end goes to the U-joint that is connected to the carrier bearing. So let me go show you that. This is the carrier bearing. It allows the drive shaft to flex as you're moving along. They wear out over time. Mine is marginal. It makes some noise. The rubber is all cracked. It is leaking, so it wouldn't be too much longer before it really was completely shot. So I've made the decision that I will replace it. I have found a local replacement. I'll pick it up later today so we can get started. With the carrier bearing, not going to flip this, but there is a yoke which we've already taken off. There is a nut, definitely leaking, bro, because it just peed a bunch of PB. But there's a nut and a washer that goes there. We press that off, and before we went any further and did irreversible damage, we wanted to verify that we got a local part. We do. So we're probably going to remove this rubber and then tap on the back side of this plate to slide this off, because it is a bearing, so it is pressed onto the splines here. And then we have one more U-joint that we haven't touched. This is the slip yoke that goes into the output shaft of the transmission, and we will service that after we get this knocked out. So when we start working on the carrier bearing, I'll bring it back. So we've gone ahead and knocked off the old carrier bearing. That was pretty drama free. That was putting this section of the drive shaft in a vise and then a block of wood, and then knocking at the, show you on the new one here, but knocking at that inner race right there, which is this piece of metal right here. Came out relatively drama free. This is a new one made by National. You're going to want to have this big rubber shield pointing towards the transmission when you reinstall this, and it's going to have to be pressed on. What we're going to try to do is the thread technique, where we're going to take the yoke, get it seated, and then we're going to basically use the nut that goes on the end and get everything seated. What you see my brother doing right here is, a good rule of thumb is, if you have parts that need to move and they're going to be moving together for a long time, throw a little grease in there. And that's exactly what he's doing. The grease there is just heavy duty grease that meets the standard for it. What, do you remember what it is?
It's GCLB.
Okay, meets the GCLB.
Number 2 grease.
Yeah. The kind of grease you put in farm machinery, heavy equipment, stuff like that. I keep it around because I have that. I have a tractor, so I use lots of it. And it's also really handy for applications like this. So, this is what it looks like once we have it all together. See that we do have a little bit of thread sticking out from the locking nut here, and the yoke is pretty firmly engaged on the spline in here. Bearing is nice and tight. That flex you see is the rubber isolator mount around the bearing. So we used the thread technique, it worked. We did put grease on the threads to make sure we didn't gall them or cross thread them or rip them to shreds. Use caution with that technique, because technically you're not supposed to do it for what I just mentioned. So go slow, take your time.
Use oil or grease.
Yeah.
Heavy oil.
So we got this done. We're going to go ahead and replace the U-joint up here where the transmission yoke goes in. Which just goes like that. Get that done, and then we can put the caps back on back here and reinsert the entire drive shaft assembly, get it all bolted back up, and see what happens. So we are working on getting the new U-joint in. This is what it looks like when you take the cap off the U-joint. Those little round things are called needle bearings, and it's incredibly important they stay tacked into position, which is where they are right now. We already had a scare where we knocked them out of alignment. We had to recover them and get it straightened back out. So when you go to put this in,
It pinched off some of the lip.
you have to...
Yep. Piece chunk out of it right there.
Yep.
It should still seal though.
Yeah. You have to make sure that you get the cap seated and centered before you go to sink it back in or press it back into place. Otherwise, what just happened to us will happen to you as well. Okay, U-joint installation technique. This is what we do. Take the cap off the bottom
And the top.
and the top, and then you're going to start putting your top in. Grab the U-joint, pull it up, and make sure it's centered inside the cap. Then promptly take your dead blow hammer and Hadouken it with extreme authority, like so. Now, if you've greased the yoke here so it'll slide better, a few dead blows like that and you'll get it pretty well seated, like so. And you're going to tap it in or Hadouken it in until
Needs a little bit more to fit the snap ring.
The snap ring line is visible, and then you put your snap ring in.
A little bit more.
This is the technique that we devised so that you get your needle bearings seated correctly and they don't wind up trying to squirt out or get bent.
Screwdriver.
After some experimentation, we've got a technique for getting the snap rings back in. So what we're using are some needle nose vice grips. We've got the squeeze set just right. So you squeeze it in right there at the, well, I'll say at the butt cheeks. And then you're gonna push it in. You'll hear it click, and there you go.
That's one.
Yep. And on the next,
ooh, feel how stiff that is now.
On the next set of U-joints, or the next set of caps that we push in, I will film that as well. We made a technique. And if you get this right, and these are brand new, this should be moving, but it should be pretty stiff to move. These old U-joints, they were like a crazy wacky inflatable tube guy. So they were very easy, they flopped around, and there's nothing really wrong with them per se. If you take a look inside, see if I can get this to behave. Behave. There you go. Those are the needle bearings. You can see they're worn. But otherwise, there was no catastrophic failure in here. It's just the U-joint is worn out. So I'll bring you back whenever we've got a demonstration of the yoke installation technique. And I am back. It's another day. This is the final U-joint. We had an issue where had a cap slide, so we pinched a needle bearing and snapped it, so I had to buy a new U-joint. But it's in. Didn't smash any bearings this time, and I went ahead and I used, see if I can get it to show here. Oh. I used this greasable Zerk, and you'll see that there's red grease kind of leaking out of everything. I pumped it until I started seeing grease coming out, and what that does is it forces out any air that's inside the area that needs to move to make sure you have all grease, and that'll ensure that this is going to have a longer life. So the next step for me is I'm going to put the drive shaft back together. As a reminder, there are two caps that go here and here that join the front part of the drive shaft, which is what this is, to the rear part of the drive shaft, which is right here. And then I'm going to get under the vehicle, slide it all back in place, and bolt it together. Hopefully everything lines up, and then I'll take it for a test drive. Now, if you're being really thorough about this, which I wasn't, I was in a hurry, so this is going to bite me in the butt probably. Drive shafts have to be balanced so they don't wobble and make excessive vibration. I think that's what this is. This is a drive shaft weight, and I've seen a couple, such as right here, and some here. I think those are drive shaft weights, and when you take a drive shaft out, you really need to mark how everything was oriented using a paint pen, Sharpie, scratches, whatever. But the idea is when you take it apart and you service it, the orientation stays the same when you put it back together so that the drive shaft stays in balance and you don't get excessive vibration. I'm going to see what happens. Something to note as I'm putting this last U-joint in position, you'll see that there's a metal tab there. You need to make sure that when you reinsert the U-joint that the caps will fit. See if I can get, there it is. Fit inside of this metal tab. Make sure that you don't have a U-joint that's too big. Now you see I've got the bearing caps on. These were not on crazy tight when I took them off, so I snug them firmly with my hand. They are 8mm bolts. Pretty straightforward installation. Now that this is locked in place and the caps can't come flying off on me, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pump grease in here and purge all of the air out of the U-joint. Alright, and to do that, let's see if I can get a big enough gap here so I can get this on. I'll do this one-handed here. I have a locking nose here, so it shoot. Hang on, I got it on there. So I installed this locking coupler to replace the default one, because the default one can be an extraordinary pain in the butt to get on and off. Locking one's amazing, on and off much easier, but it is bigger, so it will argue with you when you're trying to move things in and out. So let's look around the blue ring as I pump this in. You'll see I didn't have it on tightly, so it just completely blew off. Okay, finally was able to get a setup where you might be able to see this in action, so keep an eye out around the blue seals. See how we just had grease squelch out all of them? It means this one's full and it's good to go. As you prep for reinstallation, be mindful of the spline shaft you have up in the yoke here that engages the back of the transmission. I've already sprayed it out with brake cleaner, put some fresh grease in it, got all the dirt and contaminants out, but we want to keep it that way, so be careful when you go to move the drive shaft down. It's going to be flopping everywhere, and this is the first thing that needs to go in before you get the carrier bearing lined up and bolted back in, before you get the back of the drive shaft yoke bolted up to the differential. You got to take care of this first, so you don't want sand grinding in here. Do your best to keep it clean. Alright, so after some quality sweating and swearing and a lot of material removing, drive shaft is back in. That's back at the differential. And here is where I struggled. See if I can get the light on it. There we go. Carrier bearing. The bearing is too wide for the mounts. Let's see if I can get this line up. There's one of them. It's too wide for the mounting holes in the bracket on the truck, so I had to use a lot of the not right tools and remove material so that I could actually get the holes to line up and drop the bolts through. And then I had some extra washers lying around in my stash that were bigger, so that the bolt head's still gripping the carrier bearing tightly, and all is well. As you can see, here we go, got the yoke. It's back in the transmission, so that looks good. Got the new U-joints there, they've all been pumped full of grease. And I at least got the back one on the way it had been. The front one probably lost its positioning whenever I was taking care of all the U-joints. So that's gonna be it. I hope you've enjoyed. If you can, like and subscribe. That's going to help me out, makes it more visible, this video, so more folks can enjoy and hopefully learn. And it sends a little more money my way so that I can try to develop more content, or at the very least, use something other than my smartphone as the camera. So until next time, guys, adieu.